Hello and welcome to our lecture today. I'm calling this lecture Middle Vedic because we're going to be getting later to the challenge to the types of rituals and the type of context that we're going to see in the lecture today. And that will be the late Vedic. And you can consider the Rig Veda that we looked at before to be sort of early Vedic. Okay, so one thing I want you to remember is all of the rituals we're looking at are not like what we find in Hinduism later. They're related, there are elements of it, but we have this argument throughout Hinduism that everything in contemporary Hinduism goes back to the Vedas, but we don't see a lot that actually looks like what contemporary Hindu rituals look like, other than, say, offerings into a fire. I want you to be sort of aware of all the different rituals that we're discussing today, because they'll come up again later. But I also want you to just have a sense of the overall vibe of these rituals. So what are the Brahmanas? Our text that we read today, The Hindus, an Alternate History by Wendy Doniger, has a chapter called Sacrifice in the Brahmanas. But what are Brahmanas? Well, this might confuse you. So the Brahmanas are texts. Let's look at a little bit of terminology here. So you have Brahma, who's a god. Then you have Brahman, which is this sort of creative principle, formless being, pure being, a formless deity would be Brahman. Then you have Brahmin, or as we say in English, we say a Brahmin priest. In the Sanskrit, it's Brahmana with a long A. So a Brahmana would be a priest. And then finally, you have the Brahmanas. Now, I know this is confusing, but the Brahmanas are texts. These are sort of our middle Vedic texts. So they're sources, they're scriptures. So what are Brahmana texts? Well, they're sort of like secondary sources in a way. They're considered Shruti, so they are considered revealed. But what we see that they kind of function as is they're sort of attached to all the other Samhitas. So let me say this again. You have the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yajurveda, and the Atharva Veda. These are revealed texts that the Rig Veda is hymns, the Samaveda is the melodies for how to sing the hymns, the Yajurveda is descriptions of ritual, but they are not completely all fleshed out. And then you have the Atharva Veda, which is sort of miscellaneous extras. So around the year 800 to 600 BCE, you see these Brahmana texts that are written. In fact, the era of 1000 to 500 BCE, before the Common Era, was a time when a lot of these rituals have a lot of innovation and they get sort of worked out in details. Our Rig Veda originally was written in 1500 BCE. What the Brahmanas do is they will be almost like a commentary on the Rig Veda or the Yajurveda or the Samaveda or the Atharva Veda. They explain what isn't found. They flesh out everything. So they're sort of exposition onto the Vedas. They contain ritual instructions and also stories and narratives that explain the details that aren't worked out in the Vedas, or they explain variations on the rituals as they are found in the Vedas. So they would often provide verses and hymn from a Veda and then write an exposition in them. That exposition would be in a more simplified language. I personally find them a lot easier to understand than the Samhitas, than the Rig Veda Samhitas. They incorporate information and material from what I like to call adstratal traditions. That means parallel cultural formations that the Vedic people would consider lower. So they would hear folk stories and folklore around, and they would often put these into the Brahmanas. So we can read through these Brahmanas, as Doniger does, to find these sort of stories and legends that would have been non-Vedic but get incorporated into the Vedas. We see that the earlier scriptures were written as hymns, and they were written in verse. And these texts, these Brahmanas, actually start to write in prose. One way to think of it is that the Rig Veda and the Vedas in general ask sort of like questions about the world and show some uncertainty. But as Doniger describes, in the Brahmanas, these texts actually posit solutions where once there were only questions. Now, as I've said, they start to explain the rituals in more details and explain intricate theories. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to look at this image here. This is an image from a yoga text, and it's written in a script that wouldn't have been found in the Vedas. But you see that there's that main chunk of text in the center there. That's a verse. It says tapaha swadhyadani, and it's actually talking about generating ascetic energy that leads towards a greater sense of health and whatnot. Anyway, so around it, above and below, you'll see all of this writing. That writing explains every word and tells what's going on in the scripture. This is what we call a commentary. So in the Western world, a commentary would be like if you look at a verse of scripture and then you explain the commentary on it, you make comments upon it. So in many ways with the Brahmanas, this is where we first see this type of text that becomes very common in later Hinduism. Now, intriguingly, these texts, these Brahmanas, were not taken very seriously by scholars for a long time. Some scholars, Western scholars in particular, would argue that the language and content is so different that it must be a degenerate form of Vedic knowledge. Some people just couldn't figure them out and said, this is all nonsense, typical of Indians, that they would write all these nonsensical texts. Well, if they'd studied these texts more and looked at them in context, they actually are not that hard to understand. At least I don't think so. Doniger actually wrote a whole book that just translated narratives in the Brahmanas and called it Tales of Sex and Violence, because there's a lot of sex and a lot of violence in the Brahmanas. Now, each Brahmana text is not just connected to a Vedic Samhita, so each text is like not just connected to the Rig Veda or the Yajur Veda or the Samaveda or the Atharva Veda. But we see that each one of these Brahmanas is connected to a lineage or a clan of Vedic Brahmins. The word for these clans or lineages is shaka, which means branch. So they are literally like branches off a tree. Now, one of the arguments that Doniger makes over and over that I think is true is while these earlier Vedic Samhitas expressed uncertainty and mystery around the gods, around sacrifices, and around the power of the gods and sacrifices, the Brahmanas assert that Vedic ritual and mantras, if they're done perfectly, will resolve the dangers of life and death. So whereas a Vedic text might argue that who knows who created the world, the Brahmana text will say, no, this God created the world and created the world in this way using ritual and using specific mantras or spells and hymns to create the universe. So what is the historical context? I mean, it's what would cause people to go from positing great uncertainty about the world to a greater sense of certainty? Well, they headed west and they got more complicated, or they headed east and they got more complicated. So around the years 1000 to 100 BCE, Vedic sources start to mention new geographic terms, and those geographic terms are outside of the Punjab, which is in the northwest of contemporary India or eastern Pakistan. We start seeing mention of cities. The Vedic culture spread east, and at that time, cities started to form. So we see them first start to shift to what is now Delhi, where New Delhi would be found. And then they were on their way to Bengal, all the way to the east of this map, where you see all those sort of clustered little areas around Magadha and Anga and Videha. That's where they ended up. And at the same time, some of them headed all the way back west to what is now Gujarat, which is to the far west on this map over here, where you see that tiny little sub-peninsula come out. So what cities do we start to see first? Well, we see the city of Hastinapur, which is where Delhi is. And then you also see the city of Kashi, or Benares, that is founded somewhere between 1300 and 1000 BCE, before the Common Era. Benares is on the banks of the Ganges. It is one of the most holy cities in India. And it is said that if one dies there and is cremated, they will instantly become liberated. More when you really look at it, though, how the rituals work and the death traditions of the Ganges River and of Benares work, is that one is guaranteed a heavenly rebirth. or they go to heaven when they die. So we begin seeing kings and kingdoms. Now, these rulers were not emperors. Their kingdoms were not vast, as we will see in the next period we look at in the area of the Mauryas and the Guptas. These kings were upstarts. They would come and go. They didn't have a lot of land, but there was a fair amount of them. Now, kings would sponsor rituals that Brahmins would perform to legitimize or establish their rule. So when you'd have Brahmins come in and consecrate you or like baptize you as a king, that would be a way of everyone seeing, oh, this guy's a legitimate king. Other things that the other rituals that kings would do is they would do rituals like the Ashvamedha that would consolidate or expand their power. Remember that horse would wander all around, and wherever the horse wandered, the army would follow and say, hey, this is ours now. And then people go, well, you got an army. Okay, this is yours now. You're our king. So doing these rituals would allow them to legitimize and consolidate and even expand their powers. It would also demonstrate their might and their glory to their subjects. Now, remember, I'm also calling this the second urbanization because the Harappan Indus Valley civilization had faded away. Their cities all kind of crumbled up in the Punjab. Well, now over here in the east, you start to see lots and lots of cities forming that had kingdoms around them. So in this urban context, people would see the rituals, and lots of these rituals had sacrifices in them, sacrifices of animals, and the meat would be consumed, except in the Ashvamedha. Nobody would eat the horse meat, but there would be lots of other sacrifices of cows and goats and whatnot that people would eat. Toward the end of this era, you see that all of these sacrifices that kings were doing, and they would have been doing tons of them because they were trying to compete with other kings, caused people to be very nervous and anxious about just all the animal slaughter that was going on. So there were more goods, there was more prosperity. People had more wealth and they had more substances and they weren't, dying of hunger. So folks became more socially organized, and you started to see upper classes and lower classes and out classes, so outcasts. Kings would establish their kingdoms, and as they established their kingdoms, their social structures and their caste structures would become more rigid, in fact. Brahmins at this time would organize themselves into what are called agraharas, or ritual encampments. So kings would grant to Brahmins specific villages and farmland, and the products and produce and taxes from those farmlands would be given to the Brahmins to support their ritual careers. Also, the kings would call on these Brahmins to do whatever rituals that the king needed at the time to demonstrate his might and power. We also see that iron begins to become worked at this time, and people shift from the wheat cultivation, which is common in the Punjab. Even to this day, wheat cultivation is the biggest crop in the Punjab, to wet rice cultivation, which allowed them to create much higher yields by using wet rice cultivation. One could tell the whole history of India and of South Asia based on the different crops that were produced at the different times. And that's something I get into in some of my other courses. So let's look at some of these royal rituals, the sense that kings would call Brahmins to do things, and what would be the rituals that they would ask them to do. Well, remember that with the Rig Veda, all you had is hymns. You didn't have really the full ritual instructions that get worked out in the Yajurveda, which has ritual details, but they're still pretty darn vague. When you get to the Brahmanas that explain all the ritual details, now you can have a full ritual system. So one of the first rituals I want to look at is called the Rajasuya. This is a consecration ritual. This is what makes a king a king. He's baptized as a king. Rajasuya means something like su, means something like to press out, also to give birth. So pressing out of the king, consecrating the king. So the details of this are found in the Yajurveda, which is the Veda about rituals, but it's still pretty vague, and it requires the Brahmanas, that are the texts that are associated with the Yajurveda, that expound on the Yajurveda, to really understand this ritual. Now, this ritual has a sequence of soma pressings. Remember, soma is the divine intoxicating drink used in Vedic ritual that we no longer have, but when people do Vedic rituals, they have other plants that they substitute for soma, and those plants are, in fact, not intoxicating and are often kind of bitter and pretty nasty. Anyway, so there's a number of soma pressings and sacrifices and feasts that go along with all of those sacrifices of animals. The king is actually sprinkled with specific ritual offerings and water to the point that it is the consecration is also called abhisheka. So the abhisheka means actually sprinkling water upon to consecrate something. We'll see this in other ritual contexts. Eventually, the king actually gets onto a chariot and has a chariot race, and he races around the ritual enclosure, and surely people, this had to be dangerous, and people would get crushed by the king's chariot. We have some records of that. And he would also shoot arrows and have archery contests and whatnot. So what is all of that? But it's like a ritualized form of battle. There are even moments of gambling where they would play dice, and they would also pretend to do a cattle raid. Remember that wealth is measured in cattle. And the word for war, gavishti, I believe in Sanskrit, the word for war and conflict is actually seeking out cattle. They made a joke about that in the movie Arrival? Yeah, about a little while back, the sci-fi movie. Anyway, so kings would actually, we would think, would compete against other kings to see who would have the greatest royal consecration rituals to prove who is the greatest ritual king. Now, a lot of scholars have looked and noticed that this chariot race and the shooting of arrows and whatnot are miming battle. It's a ritualized battle. One scholar has even argued that originally there would be multiple kings and they would compete in the same ritual, and whoever won that ritual battle would end up becoming the king, which is clearly that it used to be kings would fight, and then you would become the winner, you would become the king. But in this way, they would compete in rituals to see who is the king. This has been described as the agonism and the conflict that is found within Vedic ritual. Now, we've seen the Ashvamedha before, but we find some more details of it today. I'm sorry if my face is covering up the cool little picture of a guy chasing after a horse. So let's go over this kind of quickly. A consecrated king who is seeking to expand and demonstrate his might could perform the Ashvamedha, or horse sacrifice. Now, Doniger argues that this horse sacrifice is done for three reasons: to establish and maintain sovereignty or rule over a place, to atone for violent actions that are done in battle and to get power, and to increase and instill fertility in the land, so greater crop yields, and in the subjects, greater child yields. So a horse who is white would be consecrated. Again, consecrated, so it would be initiated, and so would the king, in fact. And the horse would be set to roam for a year, followed by, or in fact, guided by the army. Now, the horse and the king are said to be celibate at the time. The idea here is that the horse probably just wouldn't wander free, but the army would kind of like, go over there, horse. We want to take that guy's farm. And somebody would come and say, get out of here, you horse. And then the army would pop and say, what's that? And he'd say, oh, hey, let me feed the horse. And you guys want something to eat? And yeah. Don't kill me. I respect the king who rules over this army. So meanwhile, the king is doing his thing in his kingdom for a year while this horse wanders around and claims land for him. So after a year, all the land that had been touched by the horse now belongs to the king. The horse is a sort of stand-in for the king. The horse's body is the king's body. And the king is a stand-in for Indra or Prajapati, the powerful gods. Now, the horse is eventually sacrificed. And in this horse sacrifice, it's a grand ritual going over many days with multiple feasts, sacrifices of other animals, and soma pressings and soma consumptions. Now, Doniger writes in detail about one particularly confusing scene that has troubled a lot of scholars and is a little bit disturbing. In one notable scene, the queen and her fellow other queens, the lesser queens, come forward and they dance around the horse and chant with the Brahmins, telling bawdy, very sexual songs. And in fact, the queen is at one point asked ritually to tell all of her different lovers over the years, making you think, wait a minute, why was this queen sleeping with all these other people? Hey, this is the ritual. So it makes us think a little bit about what was the status of the queen. So eventually the horse is taken outside of the ritual enclosure and it is strangled, in which the word for it is quieted, it is shunted, it is made to be quiet, it's pacified. They bring the body of the horse back in. Now, previously in prior times, they would have stabbed the horse, but because blood was considered impure, over time they decided to tranquilize the horse, to just strangle the horse. Now, the horse is brought back in, and the queen either literally, and there's disagreement on this, or figuratively and mimes actually having sex, copulating with this horse corpse. I know, I just said it. Yeah, so the queen makes, well, I wouldn't say make love, copulates, either mimes it or actually does it. And some scholars say she actually did it. And one of my most, I think Stephanie Jameson, who I think is the best scholar on this topic, she says the queen actually does it. Anyway, so she copulates with the horse. Now, the wife is a stand-in for the earth, the widespread earth, Prithvi, but also the kingdom. So when she copulates the horse, it symbolizes the imperial power that the horse is symbol of, and the king and the god Indra. All of those things that copulate with the queen lead to the woman being impregnated by the horse, and the king's power and the god's power, and her fertility, also the land being fertile and having many crops. After a final sequence of feasting and soma drinking, the ritual concludes, and the king is now considered more than a king. He's considered like a great king, a maharaja, or an emperor. And in fact, he would issue coins. Here you see a coin up on top that has a horse and the queen on it that signifies that the Ashvamedha has been performed, that the king has done the Ashvamedha, and he's now like a grand king or an emperor. Now, there's another ritual called the Agnicayana, which means like sort of the praise of the fire, that involves soma drinking. And there are many Agnicayanas that are done throughout these different rituals of the Rajasuya and the Ashvamedha. And we'll look at how contemporary people still do the Agnicayana. Clearly, the Rajasuya doesn't happen anymore because you don't have kings in India. The last of the Maharajas gave up their temporal power in the 20th century. So there's no need for making new kings. And the Ashvamedha, of course, would not be performed in contemporary India. The last one was done centuries ago. But people still think about it in particular. And we're going to talk about some of those people. So what's the takeaway here? As Michel Foucault, the theorist of continental thought, has reminded us that knowledge is always connected to power. Power may even be knowledge, and knowledge may even be power, but there's an intimate relationship between knowledge and power. So with the Rajasuya, the consecration of the king, kings needed these rituals in order to be powerful. To be a legitimate king, you had to perform the Rajasuya, the consecration. You had to sponsor it and have the Brahmins do it. This ritual was a spectacle for people to behold, but it also demonstrates that there is a knowledge that okay, let me say this better. The ritual is a spectacle. People saw the king become consecrated, but they also told people that they'd seen the king being consecrated, and that legitimized the king, and it demonstrated the power of the king when people would tell these stories. The kings would establish their power and their legitimacy through sponsoring rituals, but also they would grant lands and material donations to Brahmin groups. So they would sponsor a Brahmin group by giving them land and money, and then the Brahmin group would do their own ritual lives, but then the Brahmin groups would also come in and consecrate the king. So the Brahmins give the king power via their knowledge and their ritual knowledge, and the kings give the Brahmins material wealth. So there's this relationship between power and knowledge. There's a connection that is sometimes fraught between Brahmins and Kshatriyas. One other thing I want you to think about is this notion of the prescriptive imagination. I'm not sure which scholar really coined this term. It may have been Douglas Brooks. I'm not positive. The prescriptive imagination, this is something I think about a lot. Really, when we're thinking about this, when we're thinking about rituals, we have to ask ourselves, were these rituals ever performed? And if they were performed, were they done exactly as the texts state? Can we really trust these texts? in this idea of the prescriptive imagination, we think that there are authors that wrote extensive rituals that were never performed and may never have been intended to be performed. They use the logic of ritual to create and write about new rituals without any real concern about whether they're performed or not, but the greater concern of, does this ritual discourse, this science of ritual, can it be expanded? Can we learn more? By writing more rituals, can we learn more about rituals? And can we learn more about religion by innovating in rituals, even though we're not doing them? So when I say ritual discourse, I mean the widespread writing and talking about ritual that happens throughout the Hindu world. I wonder about this in magic often, because in my research, I study sources kind of on black magic, rituals to drive people crazy or drive them away or kill them or make people hate each other. And I wonder, especially as I read very complicated rituals, some that are said to take years and years to perform, did anybody actually do this? Well, it's not really important. The important is things that people think about how these rituals operate. Now, take, for instance, human sacrifice. Purushamedha, there are sacrificial rituals in the Vedas to kill human beings, to sacrifice human beings. But the thing is, it's described and it's prescribed, but the details aren't as elaborate as, say, the Ashvamedha that we know is actually done. We have a few little pieces of archaeological evidence that suggests that Vedic Hindus may have killed human beings, sacrificed human beings, but they're really small. It was never widespread. And while it's in the text, I don't know if it was ever actually sacrificed. Now, are humans sacrificed in the world and in India? Yeah. But it's not done in a Vedic manner. I mean, every now and then I'll read a story about like a terrible drought or illness or a famine somewhere in very rural India, and they'll decide to sacrifice a person in order to, often a child, in order to get rid of the disease or the drought. But this is really rare, and it's really not a part of Hinduism. In fact, it's something you see everywhere in sort of rural areas and places that don't have it like a very systematic elite culture. You'll see that people will occasionally kill one another. Sometimes they'll do them for ritual religious reasons. Now, there are challenges to this relationship between Brahmins and Kshatriyas, between priests and rulers. Romila Tupper, one of the best historians around of India, writes, "The point at which wealth could be accumulated and spent on a variety of adjuncts to authority marked the point at which kingship was beginning to draw on political authority rather than ritual authority alone." So there was a point where, in order for kings to become kings, they needed to have these rituals that would establish their kingship. But once they're well established, they can have things like armies and bureaucracies and taxes and palaces and whatnot. So their own appearance and their own powers could demonstrate sovereignty. At that point, they wouldn't need the rituals as much. However, the ritual of the sacrifice as a necessary precondition to kingship could not become a permanent figure. So kingship couldn't always be about ritual. Once kingdoms were established, there were other demands on wealth that went to support the kingdom. So you couldn't just do ritual. You had to, establish institutions that would take care of your kingdom. So in times, kings would desire to do more than just rituals, and the rituals weren't as necessary once the kings were fully established. Now, religion is used to support and legitimize kingship throughout history. In fact, this pattern of Brahmins doing rituals to legitimize kings gets supported later by other non-Hindu groups. In fact, Jains and Buddhists would do initiation rituals for kings that were not Kshatriyas. So low caste, outcast, tribal, non-Hindu kings could go to a Buddhist or a Jain, and they didn't have to be a Buddhist or a Jain. They could just, the king didn't have to convert, but they could have those rituals, or they could convert. They could have those rituals, and that would establish them as kings. They didn't necessarily need to go to Brahmins. This is to say that other non-Hindu groups would do their own forms of rituals that were sort of inspired by the Brahmins to establish non-Vedic, non-Hindu kings. And later you had outcast groups or non-Brahmin groups of tantrikas and the like. So Hindus who were not Brahmins would do rituals for kings that, initially they couldn't get Brahmins because these kings weren't Hindus. they couldn't get the Brahmins to do the rituals, so they'd go to other non-Brahmin Hindus to do these types of rituals. Anyway, so another argument that Doniger makes is the tax man would soon come to compete with the ritualist. When it comes right down to it, when a king can send a guy to take your tax money, he's got power and he doesn't need a Brahmin to do a ritual for it. So there is one story that I quite like. I actually translated this at one point in another in a book I was working on. This is the story of Vrisha. Now I'm going to just tell you this story. This story is coming from the Jaiminiya Brahmana, which is a specific Brahmana that's connected, I believe, to the Yajurveda. So here there is a Brahmin named Vrisha, and he is the Purohita for the king. Purohita means the one who stands before, the one who's placed before. It's the king's royal chaplain, the king's royal priest. So Vrisha is, and this was what happened once upon a time, they say, is driving the king's chariot, because a chariot requires two people. There's somebody to drive the chariot and the other guy to, wield the axe and the arrows and to do battle with the chariot. So the king is going along, and Vrisha is holding the reins and steering the chariot. The king whips the horses and gets them going really, really fast. And Vrisha is like, whoa, we got to keep it calm. And inevitably, he runs over a child and kills the child. In some stories, this is a Brahmin child. In some stories, it's Vrisha own child. Now, the king's legal court declares that the Brahmin is Purohita, the priest of the king, is guilty because he was steering. Now, the Brahmin priest, Vrisha, says, hey, no. The king was the guy that ushered on and kept the horses going really fast. So it's the king's fault. Well, the king's court sided with the king. Go figure. So Vrisha is like, wow, what am I going to do? What he does is he says, this is unjust, but I have power. And what he does is he chants a Vedic hymn and brings the boy back to life using this secret mantra. So in this sense, you see that one of the only ways that a Brahmin can address a king or redress a king who is harming him is to use his magical power, the power of his voice. Do you remember I said at one point that a Brahmin has power by his voice, a Kshatriya has power through his arms and his might, and a Vaishya has power through his money? Well, here the priest is able to redress this murder charge by bringing the boy back to life using his own magical powers. Now, as a result of this king's poor behavior, a ghoulish gal comes forward. She's called a Pisachini, a flesh eater. And she comes forward and sits upon their cooking fires. Now, she would be invisible, but as she sits upon their cooking flames, their fires burn, but they won't cook anything. They have no might. They have no heat. So this screws up the whole kingdom. Eventually, Vrisha comes forward, and at the direction of his father, he chants an appropriate Vedic mantra, and it makes the fire effective again, and it burns up the ghoul. So what are the implications here? The implication is that there's a tension between kings and priests, and the king may use his temporal power to harm the priest. That said, the priest has the occult power and the magic to fix this or to harm the king. The power of ritual and hymn in this story over life and death is thereby more powerful than the king with his courts and his might and his physical power. Of course, it's a Brahmin telling this story. If a king was telling this story, the king would probably say, they would probably end differently, and the king would just, kill the Brahmin or send his army against the Brahmin. So what I want you to see here is the implications of power and knowledge, and how the Brahmins depict their ritual power and their knowledge of the Vedas to make them more powerful, presumably, than the kings. Okay, we watched the video today by Fritz that was arranged by Fritz Stahl called Altar of Fire. Now, this was sponsored in the 1970s, and Fritz Stahl wrote a book about this ritual, the Agnicayana, that's just called Agni. It's 2 volumes. It's a big bad book. It's really interesting. I quite like it. Anyway, I'll talk more about that in a second. So what is the Agnicayana, which you watched today? It really has to be seen to believe. I remember first reading about it and being like, what? They built a giant bird? What's going on? And then I saw this video. I actually saw it on film, and I was just amazed at how this actually worked. So what happens is, first, the sponsor of the ritual, who is called the Yajamana, the one who does sacrifice, he's consecrated. He himself is initiated and consecrated. Not only, you remember the Rajasuya, so this is the Abhisheka, the sprinkling of the Yajamana to create, so he is the main sacrificer. So he doesn't do a lot in the ritual, but he gets all the benefits of the ritual. So the Yajamana, the sacrificer, comes forward, and the fires, the sacred fires from his own home, are the fires that are used to kindle the flame used in this ritual. Next, the Brahmins create these bricks and lay them out to form a giant brick bird. Now, the measurements for the bird and for the whole ritual space are in fact dependent on the body of the Yajamana. What do I mean by that? Well, they measure the exact height of the Yajamana, and they use that as the unit to measure out the ritual space and build the bird. So they'll be like, how far does this need to be from this? Oh, I don't know, 4 Yajamanas. How big do these bricks need to be? I don't know, 1/4 of a Yajamana. Where should I stand? 1/2 a Yajamana's height away from whatever the distance they're measuring are. Anyway, so after they build the large brick bird, there's a number of soma pressings, soma drinkings, and animal and vegetable sacrifice and feasts. We're going to read about these in practice for the next lecture. During these feasts, the sacrificed animals, which would have included cows in the past, but now they only sacrifice goats. The animals are cut up, cooked, and eaten. They are feasted. As I just said, these days they only sacrifice goats. After concluding the feast, the Yajamana's soul is thought to have ascended into heaven during the ritual, as if carried by the great brick bird, and then comes back perfected, also like this bird, to the body of the Yajamana sacrificer, the patron of the ritual. Now, these days with the Vedas and the early Vedas, they have a notion of reincarnation, that you live many lives, but it's still kind of vague. And there is a notion that living in the world and aging, even though you're going to be reborn, is painful and is unpleasant. So these rituals show a way to perfect the soul, and it's thought that by virtue of performing this Agnicayana ritual, or sponsoring this Agnicayana ritual, the Brahmin is thought to achieve heaven when he dies. At the end of all the ritual, everything is burnt up. They burn the bricks, they burn the ritual space, they burn all of the wooden tools that they built to create this ritual. Now, the video we watched, Altar of Fire, was based on a rite done in 1975. Fritz Stahl, who's a famous scholar, he died a few years ago, famous scholar of Vedic ritual, commissioned and filmed the performance of the Agnicayana in Kerala. And in this ritual, we see everything that happens. The question for me, as always, is if Fritz Stahl paid for this ritual to be done, shouldn't he get the benefit in the heavenly rebirth? Oh, well, what to do? Anyway, so at the end of the video, we hear that Fritz Stahl says this is probably the last time this ritual will ever be done, because the knowledge of it has died out, and there are no Brahmins that know how to do this and have maintained the ritual purity and maintained the proper fires. There just aren't those people anymore. So this has died out. This might be the last time the ritual is performed. Unfortunately, he was wrong. So he contacted these Brahmins in Kerala, in the southwest of India, who are called Nambudri Brahmins. It's a specific type and family of Brahmins. And they perform the ritual as best they could. Notably, they don't do any actual sacrifices. They create like little images of animals that are like kind of cut up and burnt and whatnot. So in fact, there are quite a few Vedic lineages left, mostly in South India, in the East, in Andhra. We're going to read about that for the next lecture. And also in Maharashtra, which is where Bombay is. So there's also some Brahminical groups there. Now, when these other Brahmins saw the video and heard about this, the Nambudri said, all of them sort of laughed and said, how's it a sacrifice if you don't kill anything? So these groups actually do still kill animals when they do these rituals, which is contrary to what Stahl says in the video. Anyway, so we are transitioning now to look in the next lecture at contemporary practice and contemporary Vedic practice. So like I said, at the end of Altar of Fire, Stahl suggests that these rituals have died out and they may never be performed again. However, there are still Brahmins that maintain proper Vedic purity, Vedic lifestyle, Vedic rituals. These Brahmins study all of these texts still and memorize them, and they perform quite a few of the rituals, specifically the daily worship of the fire done in the home called the Agnihotra, and some of them practice the Agnistoma, the soma pressings, and the worshiping of the fire that allow one to do even greater rituals. In fact, the Agnistoma is like, actually, there's a lot of these Agnistoma rituals in the larger rites, such as the Agnicayana. And there are people that are actually doing Agnicayanas now. I wonder if, as India becomes more wealthy, we're going to see these Vedic groups get an increase as wealthy Hindu patrons want to sponsor these traditional Vedic rituals. Though wealthy Hindus sponsoring a ritual where goats are killed seems troubling, as upper caste Hindus tend to mimic Brahmins themselves and tend to be vegetarians, as most Brahmins are to some degree these days. Anyway, it's been centuries since anyone has done an Ashvamedha, and there's no reason to do a Rajasuya because you don't have kings anymore. But Brahmins still study the ritual and perform scholarly analysis of the ritual today. David Knipe, who we'll be reading for next week, spent about 30 years doing field work with a group of Brahmins in the east of India, southeast of India. And he knew one gentleman who that was his main field of study was the Ashvamedha. He knew that he would never perform an Ashvamedha, but he kept reading and thinking about the text and memorizing parts and trying to work out details of the ritual. So he's really working in that prescriptive imagination, that ritual, that prescriptive imagination of ritual that still exists very much to this day. So things are going to start to change. We're going to look at contemporary Vedic practice. And after that, we are going to see Vedanta, the end of the Vedas, which is a school of philosophy that is very much alternative to the way we've seen Brahmins thinking about rituals and thinking about religion. So until then, I hope you enjoy the videos, and I will see you next time.